I started a habit based upon what Paul the Apostle does. Paul wrote 13 letters, and in 10 of them, he begins by saying, I thank God every day for you, for the grace that God is working in your life. So before I give a talk to any group or homily, I remember that. Give thanks to God for how his grace is working in you and how it has worked in you throughout your years. The challenges that you faced, the courage that you displayed, the sacrifices that you made, all of that is God's grace working in you. And I'm grateful for the effects of that. And you should be grateful for how God has worked in you as well. And your families should certainly be grateful for that. Parenting is very difficult. It's an extremely difficult task. And as time goes on, it gets more and more difficult because a century ago, it was pretty clear what the role of a parent was. And you were reinforced by the culture around you, and you're reinforced by the other relatives. That's not always the case today. It makes it more difficult, which is why it's important the grace of God continues to work in you as you face the challenges. I want to focus on what I think is one of the reasons why Jesuit High School exists. It's to help the men, young men, realize that God has a plan for them, to accept that plan and to begin to put it in action. That, of course, requires patience, encouragement, correction, and example. And that's what you provide in your family. Patience, correction, encouragement, and example. So this is a great task, one of the great tasks that you do to promote your children, to help your children grow in the faith. And for that, I give you great thanks. The bulk of my talk is going to be about what I think are three important virtues or qualities that I think are found in the New Testament, especially in the Old Testament, especially in Jesus' teaching. Look through the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, all of his teachings. Can we find three ideas that sort of sum that up? That these are things I'm going to focus on. Now, somebody else is going to come and tell you, those are the wrong three. They've got another three. These are my three. First of the three is gratitude. Jesus gives thanks. He thanks the Last Supper. He thanks when he multiplied loaves and fishes. He's constantly giving thanks to God the Father. The 10 lepers, the one that came and gave thanks, that was the one that he said, this is the person giving thanks. Gratitude, extremely important for Jesus. Humility is also very important. The whole of the Sermon on the Mount is about humility. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who have nothing of themselves to rely upon. They can't rely upon their own power and influence and status and importance. They rely upon God. They are the poor in spirit. They are the humble. Jesus said so many times, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted was by God. And so gratitude and humility oftentimes work together. When we recognize that we're not responsible for what God has given to us, we respond with gratitude. And the third one is obedience. There's a constant theme of Jesus, constant theme throughout the Old Testament. A hunger and thirst for righteousness that Jesus says in the Beatitudes. We pray, Our Father, your kingdom come, meaning your rule will be established. That we obey you is what Our Father is all about. Throughout the Old Testament, the prophets are saying, learn that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. He desires obedience and not sacrifice. And of course, Jesus, on the night before he died, in the Garden of Gethsemane says, not my will be done, but your will. Obedience. So the challenge that we need to address in our lives is all those things that interfere with our humility, with our gratitude, and our obedience. We live in a culture that does not value those things. And so when I talk to the graduating class of 4 years ago, I mentioned 3 frames of mind that are unhealthy and that try to get out of that mind. We all have these frames of mind to some degree or other, and I call them ideologies. And evaluating any ideology, any frame of mind, we ask ourselves, does it make me angry? Does it make me resentful? Does it make me depressed? Does the frame of mind that I have make me anxious, vindictive, isolated, lacking any sense of humor? Or does my mentality, my frame of mind, help me to live as God planned me to live? And our mindsets, the 3 mindsets, they're antithetical, humility, obedience, and gratitude. These mindsets are so deceptive because there's partial truth in them. As in all ideologies, there's a partial truth. And that's why they're so seductive. But when we take the partial truth and make it the whole truth, that's when we get into trouble. And this example of this, of course, in our own personal lives. Our thinking is, we have all or nothing thinking. All or nothing. Either I'm a total success or I'm a complete failure. We ever thought that? Or seen people who thought that? We overgeneralize. Well, one person doesn't like what I'm saying. Everybody must hate. Those kinds of things. The battle is for truth every day. Not to exaggerate things, but to see where the truth is. And the truth is always more complicated than we sometimes prefer. So these are our 3 frames of mind, 3 frames of thinking that counteract gratitude, obedience, and humility. The first one is a good thing. All of them are good things. It's autonomy. You raise your children to be autonomous. There's a point where they learn to tie their shoes. You don't have to tie their shoes for them. That's a step in the road to autonomy. And of course, as children grow in adolescence and so forth, they grow in autonomy. The problem is, they think their autonomy should be greater than it is. That's the story of adolescence. And that's normal. But that's why we have conflicts. No, you shouldn't be making that kind of decision. But a healthy autonomy observes boundaries. Observes boundaries. Take the creation story of Genesis. What does God do? He separates light from darkness, the sea from the land. He sets a boundary. He says a boundary for the sea, a boundary for the light, a boundary for the darkness. He's setting boundaries. And that's what the truth is. We live in a world of boundaries. If we have an exaggerated notion of our autonomy, we don't like our boundaries. So that's the big problem. Especially when people say, my truth. Should we hear that all the time? Leaders saying, people being interviewed, well, my truth says this. There is no such thing as my truth. It's either true or it's not. And my truth, that whole philosophy, is a tremendous deception that's being imposed upon our culture. You can't say my truth as if you own the truth. Truth is something that God has created. And so, there are also many other statements that we hear people say. You can be anything you want to be. No boundaries. You can be anything you want to be. What they really mean to say is, don't put unnecessary limitations on your ambitions and work hard to attain them. That's too many words. So we say, you can be anything you want to be. But suddenly the message gets across to us that there are no boundaries. I can be anything I want to be. No, who can't? And of course, in the athletic realm, that comes fairly clear. Not everyone can be the starting third baseman of a major league team. We like to be, but we can't because there are boundaries. Boundaries that we do not set, but we have to observe. And so we can't indulge all of our appetites and desires as if there are no consequences. And we cannot ignore the laws of nature. So there may, someone who's had too much drink and before, and says, I feel like a bird. I'm going to jump out the window and fly. Well, the law of nature says, no, you're going to hit the ground. Hopefully it's only a one-story window for her story when you jumped out of thinking you're a bird. We can't go against nature, the law of nature. We're not autonomous. We do not make that law. Autonomous means self-law. We don't make the law. Rather, we have to observe the law, observe the boundaries, work within the boundaries. And that's where we ask for God's grace. So our autonomy requires us to have a sense of personal responsibility. And that's what you do when you raise your children in adolescence. Yes, you are autonomous. You can drive the car, you can take the car tonight, but there are boundaries. Things you can and cannot do with the car, places you can and cannot go with the car. Those are reasonable boundaries. But adolescents and adults sometimes don't like boundaries. And so that's where we get into difficult problems. God has a plan. That plan involves tremendous gifts He's given to us. But those gifts come with boundaries, because that's what creation is. Creation is boundaries. But God calls for our obedience. And so sometimes we can distort our desire for autonomy. Autonomy means I make all the rules. Well, who does that? Well, starting with Adam and Eve. They didn't like the rule. The rule says you can eat anything except this one tree. No, that's a boundary. I don't like that boundary. I'm going to take that fruit and eat it because I make the rules. I'm autonomous. Cain kills Abel. Same thing. There's a boundary there. No, I resent Abel, and I'm going to get rid of him. The great flood, the flood. People not observing the boundaries, the consequences. Tower of Babel. All those stories in the book of Genesis about people not keeping the boundaries and disaster that comes forth from that. And so we ask Mighty God for the grace of obedience in our lives. Look to the characters of the Old Testament and New Testament and the saints as examples of obedience, and the saints in our families, our relatives, parents, grandparents, children even, relatives, who exemplify obedience to God's plan even when that involves sacrificing their lives. Think about them and cherish them and pray for them. If they're still alive, pray for them that they continue to be open to God's grace. If they're deceased, pray for them in thanks for the example that they gave. The second frame of mind, the second step of attitude, at the end it's a good attitude to have. It's a very good attitude to have. And without it, there'll be difficulty and problems. It's when it becomes exaggerated. And that is the opposite of humility, which is not pride, I'm going to say, but perfectionism. It has to be perfect. Now, all of us from time to time go to that mode, especially when it's something very important for us. Preparing something, we want the place to look good, the food to be well prepared, we want things to be perfect, we want to impress people. That's good. I certainly want my surgeon to be a perfectionist. Oh, it's only 3 inches off, it'll work. No. Perfectionism is extremely important. Extremely important for surgeons, engineers, all sorts of professions, to do what is right, to be perfect. But when it becomes unrealistic, placing unrealistic burdens on ourselves and on others, that's where we have a problem. That's where we're not being humble, but rather proud and perfectionistic. So I see humility and perfectionism as being counteracting to each other. It can't be perfect. That's a disaster. I want to be perfect. I want to impress people. No, it can't be perfect. I'm not perfect. That's the way God made it. Let's live with it. That's humility. So that tension between humility and perfectionism is always at work. And defeat and disappointment is a part of life. My first talk, some of you may remember it, to the parents assembled in the auditorium downstairs. I said to them, you and I, parents in the school, have a moral obligation to allow your children to experience frustration, disappointment, and defeat. If we shield them from frustration, disappointment, and defeat in their first 18 years of life, what is their life going to be afterwards? It's going to be one disaster after another because they feel entitled not to be frustrated, disappointed, or defeated. And so, at graduation, I say to myself, to the parents, I hope we fulfilled the promise I made, that we frustrated and disappointed your son. Because if he wasn't frustrated or disappointed, what was he doing for 4 years? That's part of life. And we grow through that. We grow through the difficulties, the struggles, that's the great gift of school. It demands things. It has requirements. One of the worst things we have in our modern culture is to say, well, that's okay. That's okay. You made a mistake, that's okay. No, you made a mistake, there are natural consequences. We're going to help you face those consequences. We're going to support you, encourage you, and teach you, but not to ignore the difficulty. And so, as I said, all these ideas, they're lies that are going around. The perfectionist says to a young person, the world has problems. Go out and change the world. You make it perfect. That's absurd. Especially young people. They have neither the knowledge, nor the virtue, nor the skill to change anything, much less change the world. But humility, or responsive humility, would say, no, I can't change the world. I need to change myself. That's where the change needs to work. The truly humble person says, I'm the problem. I can be the problem. You're not the problem. The arrogant person, perfectionist, says, you're the problem, and this is what you need to do to change. The humble person says, no, there's a problem within me as well. Let me see what I can do to change that. That's why humility and perfectionism are at odds with each other. Now, if you have a perfectionist husband at home, or a perfectionist relative of any sort, that can be very difficult. But the consolation is, perfectionist is his own worst enemy. Consolation, that sort of dark side of this. Perfectionists are really eating themselves up on the inside because it has to be perfect, rather than saying, I'm going to try to make it as perfect as possible, but I want to be humble. I can't make it perfect. I need to live with imperfections. I need to live with boundaries. And so pray that the Lord will help us in our own lives to put aside that desire to be perfect at all times. Humility. Jesus says again and again, those who humble themselves will be exalted by God. Brother Brown gave a lot of Greek insights into his homily. It's a passive voice. The passive voice in the scriptures almost always means God. Out of reverence for the name of God, they use the passive voice. So if you exalt yourself, you will be humbled by God. If you humble yourself, you will be exalted by God. And so that's what we try to do. But the Gospels give us so many examples of colorful disciples who missed what Jesus was saying. Peter and John. This is one of my favorite stories. Peter and John go to Jesus and say, we want to be one on your right and one on your left when you come into the kingdom. And Jesus says, well, that's not mine to give. Here we are. The disciples are constantly self-promoting. Instead of saying, what can I do, Lord, to be of service? They want to be number one and number two in the kingdom, because misunderstood what the kingdom is all about. But, of course, after Jesus dies and rises from the dead, and the Holy Spirit comes upon them, they do indeed know the truth. And they offer themselves, offer their lives, first of all, to preach the gospel, to expand the faith, and then to pay for that with their lives. So, example, Jesus himself was a humble person. Paul says in Philippians, Christ Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not consider his identity with God something to cling to hold on to, but rather emptied himself, taking the form of a human being. He humbled himself. That's the example that we have. Our God has humbled himself to become one among us. And not just that, he accepted death on the cross for our salvation. So let's give thanks to Almighty God for all the many ways in which he's provided for us examples of humble people that we can follow in our lives. People with scriptures, of course, the saints, and those humble people in our own families. To say, you know, this person is someone I really admire because they do what is right. They sacrifice themselves. They want to do as best they can, but they recognize their limitations. And finally, the third area is gratitude. And gratitude is perhaps the best tonic, the best medicine in the spiritual life. Is gratitude. Is to give thanks to God, because it changes our perspective. So, thank God for what we have and who we are. If I do that, it's pretty hard for us to feel being a victim, because victimization says, I deserve better. I deserve something to be different. Gratitude says, I thank God for what I have. So the truth is, all of us have been victims of some sort to some degree or other. Some tremendous way in which they've been victims, tremendous way in which they've been taken advantage of, perhaps, and not given the due, not given the respect that they need, hurt physically and emotionally. There are people who have truly were victims. But all of us, to some degree or other, can be said, I'm a victim in some way. But if we focus on that, we lead ourselves down the wrong direction. Yes, I was taken advantage of in this situation. But thank God, there's so much that I'm thankful for, because I'm able to bounce back. I'm able to see another side of things. I'm able to deal with this difficulty. Always thank God, even for the difficulties and the challenges. And so the truth is that we are not the only victim in the world. We're the worst victim in the world. Other people suffer tremendously more than we do. But when we focus on being the victim, we open ourselves to powerlessness and depression. That's it. Oh, you just say, it's again a lie. Yes, I'm a victim, but is that the whole picture? Is that the whole picture of me as a victim? One of the ways in which what they call cultural Marxism works is to divide people into victims and oppressors. And so you're a victim and then an oppressor. And that's absurd, because we all in our own ways have been victims, and all of us in our own ways have made mistakes and have hurt other people. But to say this person is completely a victim and this person is completely an oppressor does not make any sense. But it's very popular to hear, oh yeah, I'm a victim. And that leads us to self-pity, which is one of the worst things we can do for ourselves. It is a terrible feeling to get into, to feel sorry for yourself, because it's not allowing the grace of gratitude to work in your heart. It's focusing on one thing that's not the whole picture. Self-pity is like Superman's kryptonite. It destroys us. It weakens us. It takes the energy and power out of us, because we're focusing on what we can't do and how terrible it is and all the negativity. So that's a part of our lives that we need to do away with. When we feel we're a big victim, what do? Well, we blame others. And And others are responsible. I'm not responsible. I didn't do anything. I'm the victim. You're responsible. Not true. Not true. Because we want to see things in black and white terms to make ourselves feel good, but actually limiting ourselves and causing us to be more discouraged than we ought to be. So we blame others. We feel powerless if we identify ourselves totally as a victim. It promotes in us anger. We're angry. And think about that. Last time you were really angry, you said to yourself, I'm a victim. That's what you said when you're angry. Because you're saying, no matter who you are, if you become angry, you're a victim. I'm a victim of the person who pulled out in front of me on the interstate the other day. And so you feel angry about that. This is both a problem with men and women. But men will say terrible things about the person in front of them. I'm a victim. This terrible thing has happened to me. What was it? No, but we become angry. But angry is, so much anger, is based upon our identity as a victim. Of course, it leads then to envy. Okay? I don't have what you have. I envy you. I'm a victim. I ought to have it. Nonsense. But this is a frame of mind, mentality that the victim imposes on itself. So it's one of the worst kinds of thinking that we can have. Now, envy, of course, can be helpful if it is, oh, I really admire the way that person has achieved these things. Let me work to achieve in the same way. Or this person has set a high standard. I want to meet it. I'll be a perfectionist. I want to meet that standard. That's good envy. That's benign envy. But malicious envy is where we begin to eat it ourselves. I ought to have X, whatever that is. If it's a material good, if it's a feeling, a sense of status, whatever it is, I ought to have it. No. Where is that written? It's not written anywhere. It's in your mind and in your heart. And it's leading you to unhealthy attitudes. Of course, self-pity is based on entitlement. I'm entitled to this. This is one of the issues we face in our society. A tremendous degree of entitlement. Now, there are all sorts of generational studies, and some generations are accused of being more entitled than others. Not true. Every generation has its sense of entitlement, and it's dangerous, and especially dangerous if you say, well, I'm not entitled that you are. Well, no. Let's look at it with honesty. All of us can fall into a sense of entitlement, of you owe me, it owes me, whatever. This should not have happened. I'm the victim, and therefore I'm entitled. All this is a self-deception, because we're not entitled. We've been given everything that we have and rejoice in, given it by God. Therefore, our response is a response of gratitude. Thanks be to God, what God has done. That should be our response when we feel envious. We don't always have to feel envy. There's no way of avoiding feeling envy. That's how it happens. I wish I were, I wish I had. But what is our response? Yes, I wish I had this friendship or this connection, but I don't. But look at all the other things God has done for me. I wish my husband would do such and such. You know, I wish he'd do something about this, whatever it is, cutting the grass, whatever. And so you focus on that. No. You envy the person next door who takes good care of the garden, whatever. That doesn't work, because you need to thank God for the husband that you have. And not just husbands. I'm not going to do a very good job with this example. But nonetheless, the idea here is, when you see a lack and you see someone with something, don't say, they don't deserve that. Say, thank God for what God has given to me. The grace and strength He's given to me. Be grateful. And so we ask to God for grace and strength to have gratitude as the antidote to envy. And that's one of the things we need to practice in our spiritual life. is to say, what am I grateful for? Maybe at the end of each day. What has God given me this day? Or what am I grateful for? And therefore, how should I behave differently because I'm grateful? Gratitude is a great antidote to the poison of self-pity. So we're talking about lies, and sometimes we say one of the most common lies that we hear people say is, I can't change. I've been this way for all these many years. I can't change. Of course, certain things you can't change. Obviously, they're physical things you can't change. But there are things you can change in your attitude and your thinking. And we need to ask God's grace and openness to see where we can change. That's the challenge of our personal growth. Where can I change? Where can I do things differently? Where can I acknowledge God's grace and strength in my life? And so the challenge to change is the challenge to practice these three virtues. The virtue of fidelity and obedience to counteract unhealthy autonomy. Okay, that's one thing we could do. We could also be challenged to be humble to counteract the negative effects of perfectionism. And finally, we can have the grace of gratitude to counteract that destructive power of victimhood and self-pity. Let's give thanks to Almighty God. And giving thanks to God for His grace to you. And so I give thanks to God once again for the many ways in which He's blessed you in your life, many ways in which Jesuit High School has been a blessing to you and your family. And also, thank God for the ways in which you have blessed the Jesuit High School community. So let's take a moment to turn to God in prayer.